What's going on, everybody? I'm Taylor Carter, and you are watching Taré Kitchen, where I show you how to cook food from all over the world and internet and out of a cookbook occasionally and such. That brings me to what today's installment's all about. I'm pretty excited about it. I'm going to have fun with it, and I think you'll love it. I'm going to be showing you how to cook Momofuku Ramen at home out of one of Chef David Chang's cookbooks. This is a great cookbook, a lot of great recipes. If you don't own it, you should, especially since that's where today's recipe is coming from. Now, I will be completely honest with you and let you know that you need to carve out like an entire day to execute this recipe properly. It's not very difficult to do. It's just time consuming, but it's totally worth it. So anyways, let's get started. All right, step number one, you're actually going to need to do the night before you make your ramen. And it's really simple and it only takes a couple of minutes. And that is to do a dry brine on the 2 cuts of pork that are going to ultimately be ramen toppings. And the dry brine is super simple. All it is equal parts coarse kosher salt and granulated white sugar. We're going to liberally coat both of these pieces of meat in them. The 2 pieces of meat we have are a boneless pork shoulder and a pork belly. The only thing that you need to keep in mind about the pork belly, which I'm experiencing here, is when you buy it from the store, oftentimes it still has the skin on, so you're going to want to cut that off prior to applying the dry brine. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. All right, so now I've got the skin cut off of the pork belly. I don't leave all of the fat on top of the skin side. I leave some of it. It's a pretty fatty cut of pork, so there's going to be plenty of fat to render through and make it super tender. So now I'm going to go ahead and apply the salt and sugar mixture really liberally to both cuts. All right, now I've got both of these cuts really well coated in the dry brine. You're going to want to make sure to get all sides of both pieces. In the cookbook, it calls to put these in a tight-fitting container and leave them in the refrigerator for at least 6 hours, but no more than 24 hours. Now, I f***ed this up the first time I did this, and I used like Pyrex dishes to do this, and then I baked them in those dishes. And I'm still trying to get the shit out of those dishes where the sugar caramelized and burnt on. So luckily I remembered that I have a ton of these little disposable aluminum foil pans from back when I used to grow weed. So that's what I'm going to do is use these. That way they're just, you can toss them when they're done. There's no cleanup. It's super easy and they're pretty tight fitting. It works out really well. Pretty tight fitting for both cuts. So now they're in there. I'm going to cover these with plastic wrap and leave them in the refrigerator overnight. One other good thing while I'm thinking about it, about doing this meat this way, is you can actually use both of these as ramen toppings in instant noodles. And I'm not talking about that garbage. You know what I'm talking about, the stuff you get at most stores. That's not good stuff. But the instant noodles, if you go to like a true Asian supermarket, Japanese, Korean, Thai. A lot of times you can find some really tasty and legitimate instant noodles. In fact, I have got an example for you. Give me a second, I'll show you. And I'm not talking about just that nasty noodles in a styrofoam cup kind of stuff, but yeah, here you go. Something like this. This is a good one that I often eat. This is a good noodle in a seafood sauce, and then you can get them. This one here, this one's really good. It's in like a black bean sauce. These are a great base to throw some awesome toppings in, like some good roasted pork belly or some good roasted pork shoulder. So that's something that I've only made this ramen recipe once, but I've actually made this particular pork recipe a couple of times to add to stuff like that, and it's worked out really well. But anyways, I'm going to stick these in the fridge like I said, and I'll see you tomorrow. I made it through the night. Ended up drinking way too much beer, but hey, it's Sunday fun day. I'm going to get to eat some delicious ramen for dinner, so try to my mood up. So it looks like our pork survived the night as well. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the 4 main components that are going to go into making this ramen. That's going to be the broth, the taré. The taré is basically the seasoning for the broth, and in this case, it is more or less a roasted chicken bone infused soy sauce that'll lend a ton of deliciousness to the broth as we get closer to the finished product. Then we have the noodles themselves. Yes, we're going to make those as well. And we've got the toppings, and we're going to be dealing with the toppings as we go. But as you can see here, the pork has actually rendered quite a bit of liquid out of both cuts. So what we're going to do is pour off of that excess liquid. And I'm going to flip this pork belly over, give the side with the most fat up top. This is not one of those debatable things. I know when people smoke meats and things like that and they're trying to make them tender, a lot of people like to go fat side down to insulate it from the heat or whatever it is. But we're going into an oven, so it's no big deal. That's not up for debate, and that's what the recipe says to do, is to go fat side up. So the pork shoulder, its entire cooking process is going to be low and slow at 250 degrees. But one of the more important things to get your head around when you're making this recipe at home is oven management. If you're like me, I've got one oven, and I don't have 2 days to make this ramen. I've got one. So what we're going to do is we're going to roast some things together, and I'm going to have to cheat a little bit. Show you what we got here. We're going to have to, in addition to roasting the belly and the butt, we're going to have to roast some chicken backs for the taré and some pork neck bones for the broth. But what we're going to do is all 3 of these components are going to go in the oven together at 450 degrees. Now, we're cheating a little bit because the pork neck bones are supposed to be, according to the recipe, roasted at about 400 degrees for an hour or so, but I don't have that extra hour, so what we're going to do is we're going to roast them at 450 along with the chicken backbones, and the first hour of the pork belly is going to be at 450 degrees, and then we're going to reduce the heat down to 250, and we're going to finish the pork belly and introduce the pork shoulder, and it'll cook down all nice and tender, and it'll be an awesome, delicious ramen topping. So I'm going to put this stuff in the oven and set a timer for 30 minutes. I'm going to check on all 3 of these things after 30 minutes, especially the pork neck bones. We're roasting them a little hotter than the recipe calls for, but with this other stuff in the oven, I don't think it's going to be much of a problem. So into the oven they go. All right, I'm 10 minutes in and I've already something up. Actually, I 2 things up, but luckily they're both an easy fix, and they both are related to the chicken backbones for the taré. Now, the first thing I up was we're supposed to actually be cooking these in the oven in a skillet rather than a little quarter sheet pan, and the reason for that is we're going to actually use the skillet to build that taré, and we're going to deglaze it with sake when it's done to get all those great nice browned bits off of the bottom and everything like that. And the second thing I up is you're actually supposed to cut these chicken backbones down into smaller pieces to give you more surface area, in turn to give you more browning for a better, deeper flavor. So I'm going to go ahead and cut them up, get them in the skillet, and pop these things back in the oven and let them brown. All right, this is a lot more what we're looking for. I'm gonna go ahead and pop these back in the oven. All right, now that we've got everything in the oven the way it's supposed to be, we're gonna turn our attention to getting the broth started. The first thing we need to do is add our konbu to our water. Now I've got 6 quarts of water in this pot behind me. I actually use filtered water because the water that comes out of my tap tastes like a swimming pool. So it actually makes a difference. Most of this broth is obviously water, so you want a good tasting water. But we're going to add the konbu to the water. This is like a dry seaweed or kelp or whatever it is, but it offers a ton of awesome flavor. So I'm gonna rinse this off. I'm gonna add it to the water. Then I'm gonna bring the water up to a boil and let this stuff steep for about 10 minutes at a simmer. My 30-minute timer just went off, so now it's time to check the stuff that's in the oven. Okay, so I'm gonna flip this stuff all around to help promote a little bit more browning. I checked on the pork belly. About every 30 minutes, you wanna kind of baste it in its own rendered fat. There's not quite enough rendered fat yet to baste it, but if there is, go ahead and baste it at this point. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these all rearranged, turned around to kind of crisp up some more surface area and get them back in the oven for another 30 minutes. All right, it's been 10 minutes since the kombu started simmering. So now I'm gonna remove it from the broth and add some shiitake mushrooms. These are dried shiitake mushrooms that I just rinsed off. Now I'm gonna let those mushrooms simmer basically at about the same rate as the kombu did for about 30 minutes. One other thing I wanted to mention that I forgot to when we filled up the stock pot with water is you need to take a mental note of where the water level is in the stock pot, because for the first 5 hours of simmering this liquid, we're gonna be replenishing the water up to that level at a certain point. After 5 hours though, we're gonna stop doing that and we're just gonna let it reduce down and really concentrate the flavors. All right, it's been about 30 minutes since I last took the chicken backs and the pork neck bones out of the oven and turned them over and everything. They are ready to go. As you can see, they're a nice, kind of built a nice dark brown fond in the bottom of the pan. I'm gonna go ahead and let the neck bones just hang out for a while. They're gonna ultimately end up in the stock, but I also have lowered the oven temperature down to 250 from 450. So I'm gonna let the pork belly go for about another hour, hour and 15 minutes, and it'll be ready. It'll be completely done. But I'm gonna go ahead and put the pork shoulder in. The pork shoulder is gonna go for about 6 hours or so. And every hour I'm gonna check on it and I'm gonna baste it in its own rendered fat. So, let's turn our attention back to the Taré. I'm gonna move these chicken bones over to a burner and I'm gonna add some sake to the pan to help deglaze it. And then once the pan's good and deglazed, I'm going to be adding soy sauce, mirin, and quite a bit more sake. And then I'm gonna let the flavors all meld together, bring it up to a simmer and let it go for about 30 minutes, you know, just to kind of get all the flavors familiar with each other. While that's going, I also need to go ahead and remove the mushrooms, the shiitake mushrooms, from the broth. And I'm gonna be adding chicken to the broth. The recipe calls for legs, but I've got these beautiful leg quarters. Same difference to me. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the mushrooms, add the chicken, and I'm going to need to make sure that the chicken's covered in water. I've already reduced some of the liquid down, so once the chicken gets in there, I'm going to have to add a little bit of water and make sure it's covered and pretty much bring the water level back up to where it was when I started. All right, while you've got the chicken in the pot, you're going to want to skim off all this foam that's starting to develop at the top. So I've rigged up a slotted spoon with some cheesecloth. We'll see how well this works. But you're just going to want to be mindful to skim off as much foam as you can as the process goes on. And another thing to know is when you're done with these shiitake mushrooms, you don't necessarily need to throw them away. There's actually a really good recipe in the cookbook to pickle these, and they actually make a pretty good ramen topping. I'm not going to do that today because I actually have, as you can see here, some that are already done from the last time I made this recipe, and they do make a really good ramen topping. All right, after bringing the broth to a boil initially, this is the kind of simmer that you want to let it ride with for about an hour. And you can see that the bubbles are just kind of lazily coming up to the surface. All right, I had to add maybe a cup, 2 cups of water to bring it up over the chicken. So I'm going to let that go for about an hour until the chicken's really tender and fall off the bone. And at that point, I'll remove the chicken and I will be putting these pork neck bones in there. I'm going to scrape all this great fond off the bottom of this pan because that's tons of flavor. So that will happen after the chicken goes for about an hour. But right now I can see that the sake's got this Taré pretty well deglazed. So I'm going to scrape all the stuff off of the bottom of the pan, all those good bits. And then I'm going to add the rest of the ingredients, which are sake, mirin, and soy sauce. So now that it's been an hour since we added the chicken to the broth and got the Taré started, that means a few things for us. First thing is the pork belly is done. See what I mean about all this black shit? That's all the sugars caramelizing from that initial high heat that we started roasting this at. So if you don't have something disposable, again, I highly recommend that you use some sort of aluminum foil or a lining to the whatever pan that you're going to use to roast it. So turning our attention to the ramen broth, I'm going to remove the chicken if it's ready. I'm going to check and make sure it's ready, make sure that it's falling off the bone. If it is, I'm going to remove that, and then I'm going to add those pork neck bones into the broth as well as a pound of bacon. Oh yeah, that's ready to come out. So I'm going to pull it out. You don't need to throw this chicken away either. You can use the meat in a chicken salad or something like that. But it has done its job and infused this broth with some amazing flavor. But yeah, that's definitely ready. So I'm going to go ahead and add the bacon. And one thing I did with the pork neck bones, since those had to come out of the oven in an effort to maximize our time using one oven, since they had to come out quite a bit earlier than they go in the broth, what I did was about 20 minutes ago, I stuck them back in the oven because it's still going at 250 to finish that pork butt. And that'll loosen up some of the juices again. So I'm going to go ahead and add those here, and you want to be very careful to scrape all of the good stuff off of the pan. So I'm going to go ahead and add these pork bones to the broth, scrape all that fond in, and then we're going to let this ride for I believe 30 minutes on the bacon, and then we're going to remove the bacon and let it keep going with the pork neck bones. All right, you can see I'm really scraping this fond off of this pan because that's all a lot of flavor. That's really important that that goes in the broth as well. I'm gonna take the Taré, which smells amazing, by the way, and I'm gonna remove the bones. I'm gonna set the pork belly aside. I'm going to remove the bones out of here, and then we're going to strain it into this container. So that I don't make too much of a mess. Hell, you may get a show here. This particular skillet doesn't pour very well because there's no lip on it. Been down that road once before. All right, I've got the vast majority of the chicken out of here. Let's see how this goes. That went a lot better than I thought it would. So now that we have it in a more manageable vessel, I'm going to filter it into this jar. I'm just running it through cheesecloth. That'll get all these little chicken bits and bones and some of these like little hunks of fat and things like that out. All right, I'm gonna season it with a few grinds of coarse ground black pepper, and then we're good. We've got a Taré. Just like that. All right, now that the bacon is out of the broth, we're pretty much on the home stretch. We need to let the broth go for about another 6 hours. About 5 hours from now, I'm gonna stop adding water. But until then, I'm gonna keep my eye on it, and I'm gonna skim off any kind of scum that may appear at the surface, like I've been doing since the beginning. And topping off the water to the 6-quart level. But again, at 5 hours, I'm gonna stop doing that, and the broth's gonna reduce down a little bit and really concentrate the flavors. So, what do you do for the next 5 or 6 hours? I guess you can do whatever you want, Smoke some dope, get drunk on liquor, whatever floats your boat. But not us. Not us. No, we're going to make the noodles for these ramen noodles. I don't see why you would go to all the trouble of making this delicious broth and putting these great toppings together and not make your own noodles. Now, the book that we're following here, the cookbook, spends about a half a page trying to talk you out of making the noodles yourself, but I'm a proponent of making your own noodles. I have had no luck at all finding good ramen noodles here in the area I live in. Now, apparently there is a company that makes some noodles. I think Sun is the brand name of the noodle. I've heard are pretty good. They're fresh, like in the refrigerator section. But the best I found in my area is frozen. And compared to these noodles, there's no comparison. It's totally worth doing this yourself. And it's really easy. The ingredients are really simple. All it requires is water, bread flour. You are going to have to, because they are alkaline noodles, we're going to have to add a couple of unusual ingredients. Sodium bicarbonate, sodium carbonate, not to be confused with sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate is baking soda. Sodium carbonate is known as soda ash. So you need to be very careful. They are not interchangeable in this recipe. So you need to get sodium carbonate. The other thing that we're going to be adding to it is potassium carbonate, another really alkaline ingredient. And that's going to help these noodles have a really good chew to them and hold up in a soup. If you just try to add like a spaghetti or normal pasta that you would make with flour and egg, it would just dissolve almost immediately in the broth. That's no good, but these are gonna have a great like chewy, springy texture, so it's totally worth doing it right. So I'm gonna go ahead and get all these ingredients measured up, and we're gonna get the mixing started. It's very important too that you measure all of these ingredients by weight rather than volume, because the volumes can kind of vary with just space between the granules of the soda ash or the potassium carbonate in the flour and stuff like that. So anyways, it's very important to do this by weight. I actually need to use a gram scale for this stuff because it's a lot less, and I actually do have a gram scale. Don't ask. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get the dry ingredients mixing up together before I add the water. In the recipe, it says to add water as needed. We're going to knead this with a bread hook in the good old-fashioned KitchenAid mixer for about 10 minutes on a medium-low speed. But I like to get the dry ingredients going before I add the water so I don't have stuff going everywhere. So the instructions say a medium to low speed. So this thing goes to 10, I'm gonna call 4 medium low. That's number 4. Now this is, from my experience, a very sort of tough dough by the time it starts to come together. So it's gonna really work out this mixer. I mean, it's gonna just about wanna jump off the table. So now I'm going to slowly start adding the water. So I'm going to start a timer for 10 minutes. If the dough doesn't start to come together in a ball within a few minutes, I'm going to start adding water by the tablespoon until it comes together in a ball. If I remember correctly, the last time I did this, it took a substantial amount of water, I guess in proportion to what I started with, to actually get it to work right. So let me start my timer. I can already tell I'm gonna need to add more water. And for the sake of science, I'll actually get a tablespoon measure so I can tell you how many tablespoons more it took than the original 300 grams of water that I started with. All right, I'm about 3 minutes in, and you can see it's still not coming together as a ball, so I'm going to start adding water a tablespoon at a time. All right, that's after about 4 tablespoons of additional water. You can see it's still not really coming together as a ball, but it is coming together a little bit. It's definitely looking better. All right, we've got 7 additional tablespoons of water in here now. You can see it's come together as a ball finally, and like I said, it's definitely making the good old-fashioned KitchenAid mixer labor pretty hard. All right, it's been about 10 minutes now, and I've got a pretty good ball of dough here. So the next step is I'm going to wrap this up in plastic wrap and stick it in the refrigerator to rest for about 30 minutes. And when I get back, we'll go ahead and start making the noodles. Now for the fun part. We've got our dough out of the refrigerator. It was in there for about 30 minutes resting. 20 minutes is most likely sufficient, but I let it go for 30. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this into what would be approximately 1 cup portions. And we're gonna roll it through the good old fashioned Atlas 180 by Marcato and make some ramen noodles. So I'm guessing that's somewhere in the neighborhood of about a cup. You're gonna wanna keep this dough pretty well sealed up while you're working. If you're not gonna work very quick, you're gonna wanna put it back in the refrigerator in between installments. But I am gonna go ahead and add some flour to the bench. Keep everything from sticking. Don't be shy with the flour either, you're gonna need it. And the only thing that I forgot here is the rolling pin. Good old trusty rolling pin. I actually have used this as a rolling pin for a couple of years now. I actually bought it for some old chubby girl I used to have come over from time to time, and this one never got opened, and I don't know what else you would do with this swill, so I'm going to use it as a rolling pin as I have for the last couple of years. So you're going to want to coat the dough pretty well in the flour. I'm going to keep most of my bench flour up in the corner. Just use what I need. This is actually kind of a small piece. It's a little less than a cup, I can already tell. But I'm going to roll it out. You don't need to be like really anal about this or anything, but just roll it so that we can get it started in the pasta machine. We're going to let the pasta machine do all the heavy lifting. And that is probably good enough. So we're going to start with the first phase of the pasta machine, and this is just the normal roller. In the recipe, it says to run it through the widest setting twice and then incrementally make it smaller until you get down to the very smallest setting. I'm going to tell you from past experience, don't do that. This goes to 9. I'm going to stop at 4 so that I can actually run it through the spaghetti attachment, because I like the noodles to actually have some bite to them. I don't like the super thin, fine noodles. And if you go all the way down to number 9, like I did the very first time I did that, you don't get a very good cut whatsoever through the spaghetti. You would actually need to buy a separate attachment for much thinner pasta. But what we're doing here, you can actually use the attachment that comes with the machine. So that's ideal. This is super easy to do. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of chill, you know, give you time to, you can throw on some tunes and rock out, or, you know, just take some time to think. You know, think about some creative search term that you can punch into the old Pornhub later on and see what comes. All right, I'm gonna run it through the spaghetti extruder now. And would you look at that, we've got noodles. Now all I'm gonna do at this point is add a little bit of flour, because if you refrigerate these, I'm going to refrigerate these and use these for tonight's ramen. And if you're going to hold them for more than a day or two, you need to throw them in the freezer. But if you have enough flour, they'll be good to go. When it's time to cook them again, they're not going to stick together. So I'm going to weigh these out into about 6-ounce portions. I'm going to put each 6-ounce portion into a Ziploc bag, a freezer bag. And they'll be ready for the refrigerator or freezer. And to give you an idea, this is a 6-ounce portion. These are gonna be good. Now, you just repeat until you're out of dough. One thing I will tell you though, if you don't like your noodles to be super long, after you run it through the just sort of the blank extruder before you cut it into the noodles. You may, after you get through there, if it's really long, you may want to cut that in half and run it through the spaghetti extruder twice. Or not twice, but run each half through the spaghetti extruder. There's really no way to do this without making a fucking mess. All right, that's all there is to it, kids. I ended up getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 6-ounce portions of noodles out of this, which is more than enough. Like I said, anything that you're not going to eat pretty much the same day, worst case the next day, go ahead and throw it in the freezer. When it's time to boil them, you just boil them for a little bit longer, but they're still really good. So I'm going to clean all this shit up because, as you can see, I made a f***ing mess. There's really no way not to. And the only other thing that I've got to show you is how to slow poach an egg. That's going to be one of the ramen toppings. Other than that, we got a few hours to kill until we do some last minute stuff to put the ramen together. So let me get this shit cleaned up and I will show you how to do the slow poached egg. All right, so the slow poached egg is really easy. All we're going to do is we are going to let these eggs, I'm going to do 3 of them. I've got them right there. Don't let the color throw you off. I get those from a buddy of mine. They're fresh and local. But anyways, the instructions say to find like a big deep pot that you can put a ton of water in. And I would imagine that is because they want you to be able to hold a consistent temperature, which is important. And all we're going to do is we're going to let these eggs bathe in a water bath between 140 and 145 degrees Fahrenheit for about 40 minutes. And that's going to create a beautifully runny yolk in the egg that is so good. But anyways, according to the instructions, like I said, it says to find a big old pot. And, you know, the name of the game is to basically keep the eggs off the bottom so that they can cook evenly. And it even suggests like making a ring out of foil in the bottom to keep the eggs off of it, or breaking up some chopsticks and throwing them in there. I tried all kinds of shit. And the easiest thing I found is a small pot, and I've done this many a time. This small little pot, I only ever do 2 or 3 eggs at a time. I put a little fine mesh sieve in there to keep the eggs off the bottom. And I've got it up at, it should be somewhere between, let's see, I'm going to use my digital thermometer. So we're at 147.5 degrees. Ideally, we want to keep it between 140 and 145, but once I add these eggs, it's going to drop the temperature a little bit, and I'm going to maintain it at 140 to 145 degrees for about 40 minutes, and that's going to require checking on it probably about every 5 minutes, because the last thing you want is for the water to get too warm, and then you've got eggs that are overcooked and they don't have that beautiful runny yolk that adds so much texture and richness to the ramen broth. So I'm going to add these 3 eggs in. And you can see my fingers can even go in this water. It's like hot bath water. I mean, it probably wouldn't be comfortable to take a bath in, but you can tolerate it. But you see, there's enough space for 3 eggs. None of these are very big. So I'm going to hang out and I'm going to continue to check the temperature on these things every 5 minutes or so, just to make sure that this water bath stays between 140 and 145 degrees. We are on the home stretch. We're down to the last hour. The pork butt just came out. Delicious. Looking perfect. I wish you could smell it in here. Between this cooking all day and that broth simmering away on the stove, I'm getting excited. I'm sorry. But we're in the last hour now. The only thing we have left to do is add a few aromatic vegetables to the party. We're going to add some carrot, some scallion, and some onion. That's going to go for 45 minutes to an hour, and I'm going to be ready to eat some ramen. I'll see you in an hour. All right, folks, we're almost there. One last step with the broth is to filter it. I've already taken all the big chunks of stuff out of there, so I'm gonna run it through a cheesecloth. I've got a couple layers of cheesecloth and a colander here going into another pot to get the rest out. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then we're gonna be ready to season the broth and eat some ramen. All right, now it's finally time to season the broth with the Taré. The cookbook says to add 2 to 3 tablespoons of Taré to 1 quart of broth, but 1 serving of ramen is a pint, which is half a quart. So I'm gonna season a pint right now and we'll just scale it from there. All right, unfortunately the broth is still really hot. I wanna try it by itself first before I start to season it. So I'm going to. That's good. Now it's obviously there's no salt or anything in it, but it's just got that taste. I can already feel it. You just want to keep eating it. It's very good. So let's season it with this Taré. Since the cookbook suggests 2 to 3 tablespoons per quart, we'll start with 1 and go from there. In the pint, that is. It definitely needs a little more. So the name of the game here is to flavor the broth to where, because it's a soup base, to where it's almost too salty, but not too salty. You definitely don't want it bland at all, but you want it right on that level of just as strong as you can get it without it being too salty. Oh, we're getting there now. Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna add about another half of a tablespoon to this pint. And that's gonna be about twice what the cookbook called for, but it is what it is. We're all about having stuff that tastes good. We're there. Man, I wish you could taste that. Okay, now it's time to build the ramen. It's finally time. Let's put this thing together. We're gonna start with the broth. Only gonna add probably about 3/4 of this to begin with. There we go. Now for some toppings. Let's start with the pork. The shoulder came out really good. So did the pork belly. The shoulder just, I mean, falls apart. Deliciousness. And pork belly, I mean, this is just some f***ing delicious shit. Oh. There we go. All right. Bamboo shoots. Fish cake. Kind of an obligatory thing for ramen. We'll add some bean sprouts. And some tomato. Oftentimes I'll cut these in half and roast them. That adds a ton of amazing flavor to ramen. But tomatoes in season right now, and these came from my yard, so I'm just gonna add them raw. I will cut them in half. Just add a few into the soup here. All right, and some scallions. Oh, I'm so excited about this. All right, now it's time to test the egg out. See if it came out the way we wanted it to. So I'll put a spoon in there. And there's the egg. Looks good to me so far. But the true test, I got some chopsticks here. So let's see what the yolk is like. It should be good and runny. And it is. Have a look at that. That runny yolk, just mix it in with the ramen broth and it adds just this richness that's awesome. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna add the rest of the broth. All right. Let's give it a taste. Okay, I need to go ahead and wrap this up because I need to spend some alone time with this bowl of food. So, thank you so much for watching. I had a really good time doing this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something along the way. I really encourage you to make this recipe at home. I know it takes a while to do, but just carve out a day and do it. Trust me, you will not regret it, and you're not only going to make it once, you'll be making it again. I do need to remind you also, this is not my recipe. This is a recipe of Chef David Chang's out of the Momofuku cookbook, which I've got here all greased up with handprints from cooking this recipe with you. But you may have noticed that I didn't give any kind of precise measurements as to what was going in what as we went along. And that wasn't an oversight. That was simply because I don't own this recipe. It's not my recipe. It belongs to David Chang and the Momofuku cookbook. So quit being poor and buy the cookbook. Trust me, you will not regret it. There are a lot of great recipes in here, and I've really enjoyed it. So, if you want to see more like this, don't forget to subscribe. I will see you next time. And look at that.